Margaret Ellis, 55 years old, of Pig's Entry off the Newcastle quayside, had not paid her own rent in 7 years, and the lane never once let her forget it. She did not argue. She did not weep. Each quarter day, she took a stub of chalk and wrote the date and the sum on the back of her own door. £2, 4 shillings, paid by a hand she had never seen. They talked, of course. At the shared wash-house, before a dozen women with their sleeves rolled and their arms red to the elbow misses, Gowland said it out loud. Rent doesn't fall from heaven, pet, not without a woman's earned it on her back. A dozen faces turned, nobody spoke for her. And when Margaret went to the agent's office to ask the plain question, who, the clerk, a thin man named Prass, closed his book with both hands and said, I am instructed to say nothing. For 7 years the money came the same silent way. A slip of paper, no name, no bank. Except once. 1 quarter day it came 9 days late. And 9 days was all Margaret needed. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. So before we go on, if a story like this matters to you, take 1 second and subscribe, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, back to the lane. Pig's Entry was not a street. It was a crack between two taller things. You came off the quayside where the ships lay heavy against the wall, you passed the coal heavers and the rope, and you turned into a passage so narrow 2 people could not walk it side by side. At the far end, up a stair worn hollow in the middle by 200 years of feet, Margaret Ellis kept 2 rooms. A front room where she worked, a back room where she slept. And that was the whole of her world. She was a laundress and a seamstress. She had been both since she was a girl, and she was good. Her hems did not pull. Her collars came back white as a new tooth. The gentlefolk up the bank did not know her face, but they knew her work, and the work travelled up to them through other hands, through servants and go-betweens, and came back down as coin. Not much coin. Enough for bread. Enough for coal, most weeks. Enough for candles if she was careful, and Margaret was always careful. But not enough for the rent. Never enough for the rent. £2, 4 shillings a quarter was a mountain for a woman who earned in pennies. And there was the strange thing. The thing the whole lane could not swallow. She did not pay it, and yet it was always paid. It had started in the spring of 1841. She remembered the day the way you remember the day of a death. She had gone down to Prass's office with what she had, which was not enough, prepared to beg for time. And Prass had looked at his ledger, and then looked at her, and told her the quarter was settled. Settled in full. Paid. By order. He would say nothing more. She had stood in that little office with her few coins warm in her fist, and she had not understood a single thing about it. She understood even less as the years went on. Because it did not stop. Midsummer came, and the rent was paid. Michaelmas came, and the rent was paid. Christmas, Lady Day, round and round the wheel of the quarter days, and every single one settled by a hand she could not see. The slip always read the same. Paid, by order. No name, no signature she could make sense of, nothing to take hold of. Now understand what that does to a proud woman. Margaret had never in her life taken a thing she had not earned. Her mother had taught her that before she taught her to read, and Margaret could read, and she could write a fair enough hand for a working woman, could set down a date and a figure clean and clear. Her mother had seen to that too, though where a laundress had learned her own letters Margaret never knew, for Isabel Ellis had died when Margaret was still young, and had died poor, and had left her nothing but a name and a straight back and the knowledge that you paid what you owed. So the rent was not a gift to Margaret, a gift you can be grateful for, a gift you can accept with a warm heart. No, this was a debt. Somebody, somewhere, was paying out good money on her account, quarter after quarter, year after year, and she could not thank them, could not repay them, could not even learn their name to weigh what she owed. And a debt you cannot name sits heavier than any you can. It sat on her chest at night. It followed her down the stair in the morning. That was why she began the chalk. The first time, it was almost nothing. Lady Day 1841, she had come home from Prass's office with her mind turning and turning, and she had stood in her front room in the low light, and she had felt a need she could not have explained to a soul, a need to make the thing real, to pin it down. Because if a debt is owed and nobody writes it anywhere, then it is as if it never happened, and Margaret could not bear that. So she took the stub of chalk she used for marking cloth, and she went to the back of her own door, the inside of it, where no visitor would see, and she wrote the date and the sum, £2, 4 shillings, so that someone's owed is written somewhere, she said to the empty room, and every quarter day after that she did the same. Midsummer, the chalk, Michaelmas, the chalk. Down the years the marks crept across the back of the door in her careful hand, line under line, date and figure, a ladder of white climbing the dark wood. 28 of them, in the end, though we are not there yet. To anyone else it was a madwoman's scribble. To Margaret it was the only honest account of the strangest thing in her life. A record no one had asked for. A record no one knew she kept. She refused, in those years, every soft word that smelled of charity. There was a widow 2 doors down, Nan Strawn, kind as bread, who had once pressed a shilling into Margaret's hand on a bad week when the mending had been thin, and Margaret had pressed it straight back. "I'll not take it, Nan, it's only a shilling, Margaret. You'd take it from me if I were low, I would. And that's different. You I can pay back. You I can name." She had closed Nan's fingers over the coin with both her hands, gentle but final. "I pay what I can name." That was Margaret Ellis. That was the whole of her. A woman with nothing, who would not take a shilling she could not answer for, keeping a secret ledger in chalk on the back of a door because somewhere a stranger had made her a debtor against her will. The Lane, of course, did not see a proud woman keeping honest books. The Lane saw a spinster of 55 whose rent came out of the air, and a lane like Pig's Entry has only one story for that. It began, as these things do, with looks. A neighbour's eyes sliding off her at the pump, a conversation that stopped when she came near and started again, lower, when she passed. Margaret was not a fool. She knew the shape of talk even when she could not hear the words, and she knew the way you know weather, that the talk was about her, and that it was not kind. Then it came to the chapel. Margaret had sat in the same pew for 30 years, third from the back, on the left, under the window with the crack in the corner glass. It was not much of a claim on the world, one worn place on one hard bench, but it was hers, and she had knelt there through more grief than most, and asked for less than any. Then one Sunday she came in from the cold with her one good shawl about her shoulders, and there was a family in her place, and the warden, a fat, apologetic man who could not meet her eye, put his hand on her arm before she reached it. "Perhaps," he said, "you'd be more comfortable at the back today, Miss Ellis. Not today." She heard the truth in it even as he lied. Not today. Always, from now on. A woman like her, they had decided, did not belong in the body of the church. A woman whose money had no honest name. She let herself be moved. She sat at the very back, near the door, where the draught came in cold along the floor, and she looked at her hands in her lap, and she did not hear one word of the sermon. And when it was done she went out first, before the crowd, so that no one would have the pleasure of not looking at her. She did not cry then either, but something in her went very quiet and very still, and stayed that way like water under ice. It was around this time that the slip did the only strange thing it ever did. Margaret, thinking back on it later, would fix on it hard. because for 7 years the paper had told her nothing, and she had let it tell her nothing, and she had never once thought to question the little that was there. The slip always read the same, she would say. Paid, by order, no name, no bank. I never thought to ask which bank. Why would I? A woman like me. What would I do with the name of a bank? She said it as a small thing. She did not know, saying it, that she had just laid her hand on the loose thread of the whole world. But that came later. First there was a knock at her door that had nothing to do with any of it, or so it seemed. It was a Tuesday. Margaret was at her table with a shirt across her knees, working a button that had been worried loose, when someone knocked, light and quick, the knock of somebody young. She opened the door, and there stood a girl she had never seen, well dressed, though not showily. A good grey coat, gloves without a mend in them, a face that was open and a little shy, the face of a girl who had not yet learned to be hard. Miss Ellis? The seamstress? The girl held out a cloth bundle. They told me on the quayside you were the best. I've some mending. Fine things. My own work with a needle is a disgrace, and I'd rather trust a proper hand. Margaret took the bundle. Fine things indeed. Good linen, a lady's things, the sort of work Margaret loved and rarely got now. She named her price, low, and the girl did not haggle, and there was a moment where the two of them stood in the doorway and the girl looked past Margaret into the small clean room with the fire banked low, and something crossed her face. Not pity. Margaret knew pity and hated it. This was something else. A kind of respect almost, as if the girl had expected squalor and found instead a swept floor and a straight-backed woman and a place where work was done well. You keep it very nice, the girl said, and coloured, as if afraid she had said something wrong. I keep what's mine, said Margaret. The girl smiled at that. My name's Clara, she said. I'll come back Thursday, if that suits. It suits, and she was gone down the stair, light-footed, and Margaret stood turning the fine linen in her hands and feeling, for the first time in a long while, something that was almost pleasure. A decent girl. A kind girl. She thought no more of her than that. She had no reason to. She did not know the name that went with the Clara. She only knew that on a cold Tuesday a well-dressed girl had looked into her poor room and seen a woman worth respecting, and in that season of Margaret's life it was more than she had had from anyone in a very long time. Keep the girl in your mind. She matters more than either of them knows. Now, the wash-house. Every lane on the quayside shared its wash-house, a low stone shed with a copper and a row of tubs and always too many women and never enough hot water. It was where the work of the lane got done and where the talk of the lane got done, and the two were the same work, really, the linen and the reputations both scrubbed at the same tubs. Margaret went early when she could, to be out before the crowd, but some weeks the mending ran late, and she came when the shed was full. This was one of those weeks. Lady Day was 3 days off. The shed was thick with steam and voices, a dozen women at least, arms working, tongues working. And at the centre of it, as she always was, stood Mrs. Gowland. Mrs. Gowland was the queen of that shed, a big woman with a big voice and small eyes, who had appointed herself the judge of every soul in Pig's Entry, and passed her sentences at the tubs. For years she had circled Margaret. Little digs, little questions with hooks in them. And how do you manage, Miss Ellis, all on your own? Always with that look, always with the shed listening. But she had never yet said the whole of it out loud. That day she did. Margaret was at the far tub, her sleeves up, working a sheet through the water, saying nothing to anyone, when Mrs. Gowland's voice cut across the steam. Loud. Pitched for the room. There's some in this lane, she said, as never want for their rent, never a quarter missed, and them with no man, no trade to speak of, no how nor why about it. A pause to gather her audience. The other tubs had gone quiet. Rent doesn't fall from heaven, pet, and here she turned and looked straight at Margaret and put the knife in slow. Not without a woman's earned it on her back. The shed went silent, only the drip of water and the low mutter of the copper. Margaret stood with the wet sheet in her 2 hands. The steam curled up around her. 12 women, or near it, and not one of them said a word in her defence, and not one of them looked away either. They watched her. They wanted to see what she would do, whether she would rage, or weep, or crumble, and give them the show. She gave them nothing. She lifted the sheet from the water. She wrung it, slow and even, her arms steady, her face still. She hung it on the line above the tub, smoothing it flat with the flat of her hand the way she smoothed everything. She rolled her sleeves down. She took her basket, and she walked out of that shed with her chin level and her back straight, past every one of them, past Mrs. Gowland, who for once had nothing more to say, out into the cold grey light of the lane. She did not run. She walked, the whole way up the entry and up the hollow stair, at the same even pace, as if she had all the time in the world, and nowhere in particular to be. She let herself into her rooms. She set the basket down. She closed the door. And then, alone, with her hand not shaking, she took the chalk from the shelf. Lady Day, 1848, £2 4s. She wrote it clean and clear, the newest rung on the long white ladder, and she stood back and looked at it. 20-something entries now, climbing the dark wood. 7 years of a debt she could not name and would not deny. Her silence in that shed had been the deepest wound of her life. And here was her answer to it. Not a scream, not a tear, a date and a figure written down so that the truth of the thing stayed, said somewhere in the world, even when the world called her a whore. That was the day something turned in Margaret Ellis. For 7 years she had carried the debt as a weight, something done to her, something she suffered. But standing there with the chalk still in her hand and the shame of the wash-house still hot on her face, she felt the weight change its nature. It stopped being a thing she carried. It became a thing she meant to answer. She was done being paid for like a kept woman. She was done being the lane's dark story. She was going to find out who was doing this. Not for revenge. She had no taste for that. But because a debt has a name, always, and she was going to learn the name of hers if it was the last useful thing she did on this earth. She started, as she started everything, quietly, with the paper. The next quarter day she went down to Prass's office earlier than she ever had, before the rush, and she stood at the little counter and she said, "Mr. Prass, this quarter I should like to see it signed, to see it done. Would you sign for me this time, so I know the manner of it?" Prass looked at her over his spectacles. He was a careful man, grey and thin, with ink to the second knuckle. "It's paid, Miss Ellis. Same as always. There's nothing for you to see. Then there's no harm in my seeing it." And because there was no rule against a tenant watching a clerk write, and because Prass was a man who followed rules more than he followed sense, he sighed and opened his receipt book on the counter to make the entry, and for the length of 3 breaths the book lay open between them. Turned half toward her, and Margaret Ellis looked at it with the eyes of a woman who had noticed things her whole life. She saw the columns, she saw the tenants' names, her own among them, and the sums and the dates, all in Prass's cramped grey hand, line after line the same. And then she saw the thing that did not match. Against her name, where the payment was marked, the entry was not in Prass's hand. It was in another, a bolder hand, a gentleman's hand, sloping and sure, the hand of a man who signed things and meant them, quite different from the clerk's crabbed letters all around it. One entry, in a different pen, a different fist, sitting there among the rest like a swan in a row of sparrows. Margaret said nothing. Her face did not change, but her heart had gone very still and very quick at the same time, the way it does when a long-hidden thing shows a corner of itself. Somebody had written in that book with his own hand, somebody who did not usually sit at a clerk's counter, somebody who had come once or sent a paper in his own writing, and set his mark against her name and her rent. This was no parish charity. She had half told herself, all these years, that it must be the parish, or some soft society for the relief of the poor, some machine of good works with no face to it. But machines did not write in bold gentlemen's hands. Charities did not slope their letters like a man who owned a desk. This was a person. One person, moneyed, deliberate, and hiding. "Thank you, Mr. Prass," she said, and she left, and she did not let herself hurry until she was out of his sight. That was the first thread. She pulled the second within the fortnight, because now that she was looking, she looked at everything, and she remembered the paper. The slip, paid, by order. She had one still, an old one she had kept without knowing why, tucked in the leaf of her mother's prayer book. She took it out that night and held it to the candle and read it as she had never troubled to read it before. Not the words she knew. The rest. The small printed line along the foot that she had passed over 100 times, because what would a laundress do with the name of a bank? There it was. The draft was drawn on a bank. And the bank had a name. The Sandgate and Tyne. She sat a long time with that slip in the candlelight, a bold hand in a clerk's book. A bank in Sandgate, not half a mile from where she sat. 7 years of silence, and now, in the space of a fortnight, 2 hard facts she could hold in her 2 hands. She was no longer chasing a ghost. She was chasing a man who kept his money at the Sandgate and Tyne and signed his own name to her name in a bold and careless hand. And then, sitting there, she remembered the 9th day. It came back to her whole, the way a thing comes back when your mind is finally ready for it. There had been 1 quarter, one only, in all the 7 years when the money had not come on time. Every other quarter it was there, silent and certain, before she had even worried. But one Lady Day it had not come. A day passed. 2, she had lain awake sure that at last the strange mercy had ended and she would be turned out. 3 days, 4, and then, on the 9th day, it had come, late, in haste. And she remembered now that Prass had been short with her that week, harried, and that the slip that quarter had looked different. Not the usual clean order of it, a personal draft, hurried, as if a man with too much on his mind had scrawled it between other griefs and sent it off, and she remembered why he might have. Because that had been the spring the whole quayside knew a certain grand family up the bank had buried its mistress. She had heard the bells. Everyone had heard the bells. A great funeral, black horses, half the town out to watch. She had not thought to connect the buried wife of a rich man with her own late rent. Why would she? But now the 2 facts lay side by side in her mind and would not be parted. The 1 quarter the money came 9 days late was the 1 quarter a rich man of this town had been standing at a graveside, too torn with his own affairs to remember, until the 9th day, the small silent charity he paid to a laundress in a back lane. A man. Moneyed, the Sandgate and Tyne. A wife buried the spring the rent came late, a bold hand that signed her name and hid his own. She had a date now. The exact date of the late draft. She had worked it out, counting back, sure as she was sure of her own name, the 3rd of April. And a bank, when a respectable elderly woman comes to its counter with an exact date and a plain, quiet question, will very often simply answer her. So on a bright cold morning, in her one good shawl, with her back straight and her hands folded and her heart going like a hammer under all that stillness, Margaret Ellis walked out of Pig's Entry, along the quayside, up toward Sandgate, and stood at last before the doors of the Sandgate and Tyne Bank. A place she had no account in, and no business in, and no earthly right to expect a thing from. She looked up at the stone above the door. She thought of the wash-house, and the pew at the back, and the chalk climbing the door. Then she went in, and she asked to speak to the manager, and when he came, a courteous man who saw only a decent old woman with an honest face. She gave him the date. The 3rd of April. And she asked him, as plainly as she had ever asked anything, who had drawn the draft. The manager took the slip of paper from her hand. He held it near the window, where the light was better, and he read the date she had written in her careful laundress's hand. The 3rd of April. He turned to a great book behind the counter, a ledger bound in green, and he ran a finger down a column while Margaret stood as still as she had ever stood in her life. She did not breathe. She was aware of the clock on the wall. She was aware of the smell of ink and beeswax and cold stone. She was aware of her own heart, going and going. "Here it is," the manager said. "A personal draft, drawn the 3rd of April in the year 41. £2, 4 shillings, paid to the account of Mr. Prass, house agent, on behalf of a tenant." He looked up at her, mild and untroubled, a man doing a small courtesy for a decent old woman. The drawer, he said, was Mr. G. Fenwick. Fenwick. She said the name back to him without meaning to. Just once. "Quiet, Fenwick," she said. "Of the yards," said the manager, as though that settled it, as though everyone knew. Fenwick and Son, the shipbuilders up the river. He closed the green book. "Was there anything further, madam?" There was not. There was nothing further she could ask that this man could answer. She thanked him. Her voice came out even, which surprised her, for inside her nothing was even at all. She walked out of the Sandgate and Tyne Bank and into the bright cold street, and she stood on the pavement, and the river was down below her, grey and busy, and up the river. Out of sight were the yards. Fenwick and Son. She had known men who worked the yards. Half of Sandgate worked the yards, one way or another, riveting and caulking and carrying. But the name over the gate was not a workman's name. The name over the gate belonged to the man who owned the timber and the slips and the great half-built hulls. The man whose money moved through banks in his own bold hand. A gentleman. A rich one. A rich one who for 7 years had reached down into a back lane and paid the rent of a woman he had never once come to see. Why? She walked home along the quayside with that word keeping time with her feet. Why? Not charity. She had let go of charity at the bank counter. Charity does not sign a personal draft in haste on the 3rd of April while its wife lies newly in the ground. Charity gives to the many and forgets the one. This was the one. This was a man who knew her name and paid it and hid. She thought, as she walked, that a man pays for 2 reasons. He pays because he loves, or he pays because he owes. And she did not know this Mr. Fenwick from Adam, so it must be that he owed. And a debt she could not remember was a debt from before she could remember. From so far back, it lived in other people's mouths and not her own. That night she did not sleep. She lay in the dark of her 2 rooms, and she looked at the shape of the door she could not see, the door with its chalk climbing up the wood, and she thought about her mother. Her mother had been Isabel Ellis, a quiet woman, thin with beautiful hands, who took in sewing and never spoke of her own girlhood, and who died when Margaret was still a young woman, died poor, in a room not much better than this one. Her mother had kept a prayer book. The prayer book was on the shelf now, with the old payment slip pressed in its leaf, and Margaret remembered, lying there in the dark, a thing she had not thought of in 30 years, that her mother, near the end, had held that prayer book and said a strange thing. She had said, "There's a marriage in me, Margaret, that no one would own." And Margaret, young and frightened by the dying, had thought it fever, and had hushed her, and had let it go. A marriage that no one would own. In the morning, Margaret went to St. Hilda's Chapel in Sandgate. It was an old place, low and dark, with a smell of damp hassocks. She found the curate, a young man with a cold, and she asked him, in her plain way, whether the chapel kept its old registers, the books of marriages, from before the turn of the century. He said it did. He said They were not much looked at. He brought her the volume for the year she named, the year her mother would have been young, and he set it before her on a slanted desk, and he left her to it, sneezing, glad to be back by his fire. Margaret turned the stiff brown leaves. The ink had gone the colour of weak tea. The hands that had written in it were long dead. She ran her finger down the years, the weddings of Sandgate, the fishermen and the keelmen and the servant girls, until she came to the spring of 1791. And there it was, Josiah Fenwick, bachelor of this parish, and Isabel Ellis, spinster of this parish, married in the chapel of St. Hilda by banns with two witnesses whose names meant nothing to her. Her mother's name. Married to a Fenwick. A later hand had drawn a line through the entry. One straight, hard stroke of the pen, the ink darker and newer than the rest, as if a man had come afterward and tried to cross the marriage out of the world. But you cannot cross a thing out of a register. You can only draw a line and leave it legible beneath, and the line itself becomes the loudest thing on the page. Because a line says, "A man wanted this gone." Margaret stood in the cold chapel, and she understood all at once everything and nothing. Her mother had been married before Margaret was born, married to Josiah Fenwick, which meant Margaret was not what the lane had always let her feel herself to be, the fatherless girl, the base-born spinster, the woman whose rent must be earned in sin, because what else had a woman like that to sell? Margaret was born inside a marriage, born first, the lawful firstborn of a marriage that a hard later hand had tried to strike through with one stroke of a pen. She sat down on the end of a pew. Her legs would not hold her. Firstborn and put away, put out somewhere as an infant, with her mother when the thing was crossed out, when the Fenwick people, whoever they had been, decided that Josiah Fenwick would do better with a different wife and a cleaner story. Isobel Ellis struck through. Isobel Ellis gone back to a single name and a single room and a life of taking in sewing, raising a daughter she could not tell the truth to. Dying at last with the truth stuck in her throat, "There's a marriage in me that no one would own." And Josiah had gone on. He had married better. He had a son. That son was Gideon Fenwick, master of the yards, 50 years old, a rich man in a good house. And the yards, Fenwick and Son, the great fortune of timber and iron down the river. That fortune had been built and launched in the very years Isobel Ellis was dying poor in Sandgate. The money had grown on one side of the river, while the woman it belonged beside starved quietly on the other. Half of it was her mother's, and half of her mother's was Margaret's. She did not think the word right away. She thought it slowly, on the walk home. The way you take the weight of a thing up a stair, one step, rest, one step. She had come out of Pig's Entry to find the name of a man who did her a kindness. She was walking back into it, the concealed firstborn of a shipbuilding house, robbed of a name before she could speak, and now, at 55, holding the whole of it in her two chapped hands. And Gideon. Gideon knew. Of course Gideon knew. A stranger does not pay your rent for 7 years by accident. Somewhere, sometime, Gideon Fenwick had been told. And she thought she knew when. Josiah Fenwick had died in the spring of 1841. That was the same spring the rent first began to come, paid by that bold gentleman's hand. The father dies, and in that very season the son begins, quietly, to pay. A dying man tells his son the truth of the marriage he was made to strike through. A dying man, with the account at last coming due on him, begs his son to make it right. And the son. The son had looked at what making it right would cost. The name. The share. The story told in daylight, before all the town, that the great Fenwick fortune stood partly on a woman they had cheated, and the son had decided he could not pay that, so he paid the other thing instead. £2, 4 shillings a quarter, in silence, by order, no name, no bank she was ever meant to trace. He paid her rent so that he would never have to pay her the truth. Anonymity was not mercy toward her. She saw that now, and it turned her cold. All these 7 years she had felt herself the one in debt, chalking the sum on her door, the receiver of a kindness she could not repay. And it had been the other way about the whole time. She was not the debtor. She was the creditor. The silence had never been kind to her. The silence had been kind to him. She got home, and she shut her door, and she looked at the back of it. 28 marks, 28 quarter days, 7 years, the date and the sum, climbing the wood in her own hand. She had chalked them so that someone's ode would be written down somewhere. She had thought she was writing down what she owed. She had been keeping his account the whole time. For a while she only sat. Then, something in her, the thing that had wrung out wet linen for 30 years and kept a straight back through the wash-house and the shifted pew, that thing got up and got to work. She took a fresh school copybook she had bought for a penny. She sat at her table by the last of the light, and then by a candle, and she copied. Every one of the 28 chalk entries, off the door and onto the page, in her fairest hand. The date, the sum. Quarter day by quarter day, Lady Day and Midsummer and Michaelmas and Christmas, 7 years around. She copied the one that had come 9 days late as carefully as all the rest. When she was done she had a fair ledger, plain and true, the only honest account of the thing in the whole of the county, kept by a woman with no bank and no papers, on the back of her own door, and now in a penny book. Then she did a stranger thing. She took the pins from the hinges. She lifted the door off, the whole door, the wood soft and grey with 200 years of feet passing through it, and she stood it against the wall of her room, the chalk side out, so that the 28 marks faced the room like a page. It was not a door any more. It was a document. She meant it to be seen. She did not know yet how she would carry a door across the town. She only knew that she would. Word travels in a small place faster than a person does. Margaret had been to the bank, and she had been to the chapel, and a woman like Margaret asking after old drafts and old marriages does not go unremarked. It got back to Prass, and Prass, thin and ink-stained and instructed, did the thing he had been kept for. He carried it up the river to his master's master. He went to Gideon Fenwick, and he told him a woman had been at the Sandgate and Tyne asking who drew a draft, and had been at St. Hilda's turning the old registers, and the woman was the tenant of Pig's Entry, the one whose rent was paid by order. And Gideon Fenwick, 50 years old, master of the yards, felt the cold hand of his dead father close on him after 7 quiet years. He did what such a man does. He did not come himself. He sent Prass back down the river with an offer, dressed up decent, and Prass brought it to Margaret's door, which was off its hinges and leaning against the wall. And Prass could not help but look at it, and then look away. The offer was generous, Prass said, not meeting her eye, a sum of money, a good sum, a lump, more than she had ever held, and a cottage. A cottage over the water in Gateshead, dry and whole, hers to live in. On conditions. That she leave Pig's Entry, that she leave off her asking, that she say nothing, to no one, of banks or drafts or registers ever, and the payments would go on, Prass said, larger than before, still the same silent way. Mr. Fenwick was very willing to be generous. Mr. Fenwick only asked for quiet. Margaret let him get most of the way through it. She stood in her doorway that had no door, with the marked wood behind her, and she watched the clerk's ink-stained fingers turn his hat round and round, and she understood that this was the thing she had walked to the bank to refuse. More money, more silence, the very same bargain, only fatter. He would pay her anything at all except the one thing she had come for, which was to hear it said. "Mr. Prass," she said, before he had finished, "you may tell Mr. Fenwick I want none of it. The clerk stopped. "Mrs. Ellis, miss," she said. "I never married. My mother did. Tell him that, and all." She stepped back into her room. "And tell him I'm coming up the river to see him. Tuesday he may have his fire lit." She shut what she could shut, which was only the frame, and Prass went away with his hat still in his hands. On the Tuesday she went. She had found a boy with a barrow, and she paid him a coin she could ill spare, and she laid the door flat on the barrow and covered it with a cloth like a thing for the laundry, and the boy wheeled it up through the town with Margaret walking beside in her one good shawl. She carried the penny ledger in her hand. In her pocket, folded small, was a paper the young curate had made for her, a fair copy of the struck-through entry from St. Hilda's, signed and dated by his own cold hand, a certificate of the marriage that no one would own. The Fenwick house stood back from a good street, with a swept step and a brass knocker. A maid answered, and did not know what to do with a laundress and a barrow, and there was a small commotion, and then Gideon Fenwick himself came to the hall to end it, because a scene at his own front door was the last thing a careful man wants. He was a big man, going heavy, well-dressed, with his father's bones in his face. He looked at Margaret, and something moved behind his eyes, and she knew that he knew her on sight, though they had never met, because she had her mother's hands and perhaps her mother's face, and he had grown up in a house where that face was never ever to be spoken of. "Come in," he said. "Low, quick, come in, before, come in." They went into the drawing-room. There was a fire, as she had told him to have. There were good chairs she did not sit in. The door was carried in behind her by the barrow boy and Prass, who had been sent for, and who stood now against the wall with his book under his arm, the receipt book, the instructed book, useless in the warm bright room. And there was a girl at the far door, come to see what the noise was. A young woman, 24, in a good grey coat Margaret knew, because Margaret had turned its cuffs and mended its hem on a Tuesday not long past. Clara, the kind girl who brought her fine linen. Clara Fenwick, his daughter. Margaret had not known, when Clara came to her with her mending, whose child she was. And Clara had not known, bringing it, whose seamstress she chose. Now they stood in one room, and the knowing came down over both of them at once. Margaret saw the girl's face change. She saw her look from her father to the old woman by the fire and begin, slowly, to add it up. "Send the girl out," Gideon said to no one. His voice was not steady. "Let her stay," Margaret said. "She should hear it. She's the only one of your blood who was ever kind to me, and she did it not knowing. Let her stay." Then Margaret set to work laying out her account, and she did it the way she did everything, plainly with her hands. She had the barrow boy stand the door against the wall by the fire, the chalk side out, so the 28 marks caught the light. She set the penny ledger on the good polished table. She took the curate's paper from her pocket, unfolded it, and laid it beside the ledger. 3 things: the door, the book, the certificate. She stood behind them like a woman behind her stall. "Mr. Fenwick," she said, "you've paid my rent 7 years. £2 4 28 times, and once 9 days late, the spring you buried your wife, the 3rd of April, drawn on the Sandgate and Tyne in your own hand. I've traced every quarter of it. It's all here." She touched the ledger. Then she touched the door, and I kept my own count as it came, on the back of my door, so someone's ode would be written down. I thought for 7 years the ode was mine. She lifted her chin. "It was yours." Gideon opened his mouth. Nothing came. "You did not pay my rent for 7 years, Margaret said. You paid your own silence, quarter by quarter, and I have brought you every receipt." The clerk against the wall had gone very still. The girl at the door had a hand at her mouth. Margaret took the last thing, the curate's paper, and she held it up so the firelight went through it. My mother was Isabel Ellis. She was married in St. Hilda's Chapel in the spring of 1791 to Josiah Fenwick, your father. Married by banns. Before witnesses. I was born of it. First, and then a hard hand drew a line through her in the register and put her out and married your father better and got you. The yards were launched while she died poor. The name over your gate should have had her name in it and mine, and it never did. She lowered the paper. Your father knew. He told you, dying, in 41, and he begged you to make it right, and you looked at what right would cost you, and you decided you'd rather pay my rent than say my name. She stepped forward, and she took the edge of the door in both hands, and she turned it, and she slid it a little across the boards toward him, the chalk facing him now. Close, the chalk is yours, she said. Every mark of it. Read it aloud. For a long moment the master of the yards did not move. He was a man who had spent 7 years making sure this sentence would never have to be said, and here it was, laid on his own table by an old laundress, in front of his own child and his own clerk. And there was nowhere left in the world to send it. His face went first. It broke the way a wall breaks, not all at once, a crack, and then the whole. He looked at the door, he looked at the marks his money had made without his ever seeing them, and in a voice that did not sound like a rich man's voice at all, in a voice like a boy caught out, he read. Lady Day, he said, 1841, £2, 4 shillings. His eyes went down the column, mark by mark, his own account read back to him in chalk. Midsummer, £2, 4 shillings. Michaelmas, £2, and there his voice went, closed up, and he stopped. He could not read the third. He stood with his hand half raised toward the door he could not go on reading, and he wept, the coward forced at last to say the sentence his father had died, begging him to say, and it broke him to say even 3 lines of it. And in the quiet after, it was Clara who moved. The girl came across the room, not to her father. She passed her father by. She crossed the whole width of that good drawing-room to the old woman by the fire, and she took Margaret's rough hands in her own soft ones, the same hands whose cuffs Margaret had turned, and she said, You mended my coat. You never said. All those Tuesdays, and you never once said. And her face was wet. You're my father's sister. You're my aunt. And you carried a door across the town. She held on. I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad you made him hear it. That was the whole of Clara's part, and it was the tenderest thing in the room, the one Fenwick who chose the old woman over the name. Prass stood against the wall with his receipt book under his arm and understood that his book was worth nothing now. 7 years he had been instructed to say nothing, and a woman with a stub of chalk had made all his careful silence into waste paper. He set the book down on a side table, quietly, as a man sets down a thing he no longer wants to be caught holding, and he looked at the floor. The rest of it came out into the lane, the way such things always come out, which is to say completely. There was a settlement, not paid in silence this time. Named and written and known. The share her mother had been struck out of, or such of it as 40 years could give back, came to Margaret in daylight with her own name on the paper, and within a week the wash-house had it, every word. Mrs. Gowland was at her tub the morning it went round, large, loud Mrs. Gowland, who for 7 years had said Margaret's rent was earned on her back, who had said it to a dozen women with the wet linen steaming between them. The women told her now. They told her whose daughter Margaret was, and what had been done to her mother, and whose money had really paid that rent, and why. And the wash-house, which had made its verdict of sin on Margaret so freely, watched that verdict come apart in Mrs. Gowland's hands. It had not been sin at all. It had been theft, and none of it Margaret's. Hers had been the wronged name. The only shame in the whole business belonged to the tongue that had wagged, and to the rich man who had paid to keep it wagging in the dark. Mrs. Gowland did not say much. There was not much left to say. She found the wash-house very quiet after that, and stayed quiet in it. A year on, the door hangs on a decent house. It is a small good house up near the yards, on the right side of the river now, and the old grey tenement door with its 200 years of feet went with Margaret when she moved, because she would not leave it behind. But it does not swing on hinges any more. It stands in her front room, upright, with a pane of glass fixed over the chalk side, so that the 28 marks are kept safe under the glass and cannot be smudged or washed or rubbed away. She dusts the glass on quarter days. She likes, she says, that a thing paid in silence stays said. The money she got she did not spend on comfort. She took a little for herself, no more than a decent old woman needs. The rest she turned to a use she named out loud, so no one could ever pretend to guess it. She pays the rent, quarterly, of 2 other widows of Pig's Entry, women near as old as herself, who mend and wash as she once did. But she does not pay it in silence. She pays it in her own name, and they know the name, and the coin comes second to the fact that it is said. She has had enough of money that hides. Gideon Fenwick speaks her name now at the gate of the yards, to the men, which is more than his father ever managed in 50 years. Clara comes on Tuesdays still, only now she comes to sit, not to leave her mending, and the two of them get on. Pras keeps a cleaner book these days, and no more instructions come down the river for him to carry. And Mrs. Gowland, they say, found the wash-house quieter than it used to be, and never did work out quite how to raise her voice in it again. Here is the whole of it, the thing under all the rest. Paying quietly for 7 years was never repentance. It was a man buying, quarter by quarter, 7 more years of not saying a true thing out loud. And a woman with no bank, and no papers, and no share anyone would own, kept the only honest account in the county the whole time, in chalk, on the back of her own door, and one bright cold morning she carried it up the river and made it be read aloud. So if you've ever been counted for nothing by someone who should have looked closer, remember Margaret Ellis, and the door, and the chalk. And tell me the city you're watching from, so I can see how far she's travelled.